Here I'll be talking about For the Frog the Bell Tolls, an action RPG coded up by Nintendo's R&D1 along with Intelligent Systems. The fan translation was put together by several different folks, and they don't seem to call themselves by a single team name. The story in this game isn't mind-boggling or anything, but a lot of the time, the writing is smile-worthy. Look, they even added their own puns. The translator, Ian Nihan, pardon my pronunciation, is actually pretty prolific. He even translated Karnov? Since when did Karnov need a translation? There are cutscenes in Karnov? Wow! The Japanese version of Karnov actually looks a fair bit more intense than the Western release. But we're not here to talk about guys with mustaches that throw fire. We're here to talk about games with names that reference Hemingway novels. So let's get on with it already. When you start a new game in For the Frog the Bell Tolls, you get to name the guy you play as. This is a pretty standard thing in RPGs, right? It helps you to empathize with the main character. In this case, the main character is the Prince of Sable. So, after you name him, the first thing the dope does is lose a duel. And this isn't his first loss, it's his 56th. Well, that's the guy you're playing as for the entire game. I hope you're happy. The prince just can't seem to catch a break. I mean, over the course of the story, he's required to lose all of his health on no fewer than 2 occasions. And the humiliation doesn't stop there. For such a fragile fellow, you figure the prince would be more careful about how he fights. But you'd be wrong. You see, the prince isn't a normal protagonist. No, most heroes would let you help them out with the fighting. The prince, on the other hand, is just about completely out of your control when he gets into a fight. He'll automatically trade blows with the enemy, and all you can do is watch as their health bars go down. Plus, he's such a volatile fellow that he'll automatically get into a fight with someone just by bumping into him. When you get into a fight, if your stats are high enough, you'll win. If your stats aren't high enough, you'll lose. So every fight in the game is rigged before you even enter it. Luckily, the prince does give you a tiny bit of control. You can use an item or run away if you press the B button. So, if you want to win fights, you'll have to make the prince stronger somehow. He has a few upgradable stats, and you'll find stones lying around that increase these stats one at a time. Finding the stones requires a little bit of exploring, but there's no need to worry about missing anything. There's about 1 stone in each area you visit, and before you move on to the next area, you'll encounter some kind of boss enemy. If you didn't find the upgrade for that area, you won't be able to move on. But if you got everything, you'll be fine. You'll never miss an upgrade, only to find out hours down the line that you need it. The game consistently requires that you found all of the upgrades available. The prince's stats are also influenced by his equipment, which entails a sword and a shield. This doesn't come up that often, except for when you need to shell out some nuts for a new shield. Unfortunately, all of those upgrades mean nada when the old hag Mandola turns the prince into a slimy frog. If you thought he was a wimp before, well, this won't help things. In frog form, his stats go down so far that it's genuinely impossible to win most fights. A lot of the time, you can't even land a single hit on the enemy. But I have to admit, the embarrassment doesn't come without its perks. Frogs can breathe underwater, and they can jump pretty high, which is important when you get to the platforming segments. In fact, you jump so high, sometimes it's hard not to bonk your head on a spiked ceiling. So if you ever need to make a large leap, you'll have to go into your frog form. You might figure that would help to make the platforming easier, but this isn't that kind of game. Most of the time, if your frog form is available to you, it's required. And since the Frogmeister makes such large jumps that cover monumental portions of the screen, the platforming can get kinda demanding. Heck, even when the frog doesn't get involved, the platforming still demands that you make some scary leaps. That's a weird thing about this game. The difficulty curve on the platforming definitely assumes that you've played your fair share of platformers before. The game never gets brutal with its jumping tests, but the leaps you have to make are so big, and the moving platforms you need to reach are so small, that it feels like the difficulty curve starts out too high. Anyway, you spend your time going back and forth between the two gameplay styles. You'll have an overhead exploration portion, followed by some platforming in a castle, then you'll wander around outside some, then you'll do some platforming in a cave, wash, rinse, and repeat. There's some good variety to this though. Sometimes a platforming segment will be kinda long, and sometimes it'll be pretty short, so the game's pacing never feels entirely formulaic. The overhead portions don't pose too much of a challenge, since they mostly involve making sure that you don't touch enemies that you can't defeat in combat. What they lack in challenge, though, they more than make up for in charm. For example, my favorite sequence in the game is Mount Pudding. For some reason, the townsfolk are all too scared to work in the mines, and over time, they've become lazy drunks. It's up to the prince to start a barroom brawl and inspire them to work again, mostly because he needs the manpower. Once you set them straight, though, they're a loyal bunch that pummels anything that gets in the prince's way. Granted, well, let's just say the townsfolk might have been right not to work in the mine. For better or worse, charm is the best thing this game has going for it. There's not really a whole lot of exploring to do, since the collectible upgrades are pretty limited. As I said, there's about one per area, and they're pretty easy to find. Most of the time, an upgrade is just tucked away in some cave along your path, waiting for you to come across it. There is a slight puzzle element to the game, though, in that sometimes moving forward is a matter of talking to the right people in the right circumstances. On the other hand, town areas are small enough that this generally isn't a challenge. It's not hard to just go through and talk to everybody. The puzzle element sometimes carries over into the platforming segments, too. This comes into play because the prince also gains the ability to turn into a snake. Now, the snake can't handle platforming at all, but he can slither through tiny crevices. This isn't really a puzzle, and to be honest, I found this kind of annoying. Transforming into a snake just to go through some tiny hallways isn't my idea of a good time. However, the snake can also turn weak enemies into pushable blocks. This creates an opportunity for a decent range of block puzzles, and on rare occasions, the game does ask you to do some neat stuff with blocks. However, the block mechanics come up so rarely that it feels underutilized. You get a handful of block puzzles in the game, and that's being generous. I imagine, though, that there are plenty of people who are sick of block puzzles by now, so the scarcity of them in this game might be considered a boon. The point is, this game has the makings of a puzzle-centric game, but that's not how it's executed. Instead, For the Frog the Bell Tolls is a laid-back game with some simplistic exploration and some platforming that's solid, but not entirely original, and even a little too hard. But in the end, what you'll remember most about this game is the nifty and delightful storytelling. I don't have a lot of extra stuff to mention this time around, just a single name drop. The engine in The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is based on the engine from For the Frog the Bell Tolls. In general, I'd say that the pacing in Zelda games offers a nice counterpoint to the pacing in Frog Bells. In Zelda, you move from overworld to dungeon to overworld to dungeon in a pretty regular pace. Anytime you sit down to a Zelda game, you can generally predict what you'll be playing. That's not the case in Frog Bells. Since the overhead segments and platforming segments don't have regular lengths, pacing feels a lot less predictable. And no offense to Zelda, but I think it's a nice feeling. Anyway, that's all I got for this time. See you around!